Frozen was a special film. I'm sure there are people who forget just how big it was. It was the highest grossing film of the year and was instantly iconic. There were thousands of people doing covers of Let It Go, and the impact on pop culture was indescribable. So it was almost inevitable they would make a sequel. I say almost because Disney really doesn't do sequels. At least not to like their theatrically released animated films. The most notable example before Frozen was Rescue is Down Under, which was a sequel to a film that wasn't even that big of a deal anyway. Since then, they've invested more into sequels. They made a Wreck-It Ralph sequel, they made a Moana sequel. But at the time, this was really strange to make a sequel to an animated film, but it was just so big, and we now live in the culture of sequels that I suppose it was just going to happen, no matter what. With that said, it's a bit unprecedented. How do you make a sequel to a Disney movie? The most obvious answer would be to go to the direct-to-DVD sequels, but those are usually less regarded for a lot of reasons. For one, a Disney movie is a usually pretty complete story. These movies have pretty built-in beginning, middles, and ends where the character learns their lesson, the bad guy is defeated, and everything is all right in the world. To make a sequel, to justify a continued existence of a movie like that, it's hard. Because you're immediately ruining what is the happily ever after that the first movie ends on. Movies like The Lion King 2 divulge this by instead of it being about the kid. But even then, it untangles kind of the perfect weave of the first movie. The first movie, Scar is definitively defeated. In the second movie, we find out that he had a secret family clan that we didn't know about. Or they do Lion King 1.5, where it's an in-between-quel. The movie takes place in between the events of the first movie. A movie like The Fox and the Hound is almost designed to not have a sequel. So what did they do for the second one? Well, they make a movie that takes place in between the events of the first movie. Or they just make like a pilot to a TV show, like the Aladdin sequel was, which is just basically a kind of nonsensical plot which is meant to kind of start off like what would be a series of misadventures with the characters, So they really can't look to that. So for a proper sequel, like Frozen 2 wants to be, it's gonna be difficult. And Frozen 2 was a very difficult production. There's a whole documentary that goes into it, but basically they went into the movie with an unfinished script. And during production, they had to make a lot of changes. The Olaf scene where he explains the plot of the first movie was added in post-production because they were convinced people might need a refresher. They had to change a lot from what was originally in the movie because they were confused about what was even going to happen. When Elsa goes into that final layer at the end of the movie and she finds out the history of her past and her family, the filmmakers legitimately didn't know for a long time what she was even going to find. Mystery, the big conceit of the movie, and they didn't know what was going to happen when they got there. The way the movie justifies its existence is it decides to emphasize lore over storytelling, which is something the first movie did not do. Frozen 1 was a story about two sisters. There's magic, and then there's fantasy, and there's a villain who wants to seize power, and we get a little bit of their backstory, we get a little bit kind of knowledge about the world, but that's not what the movie's really about, and that's not what the movie pretends to care about. It's about the relationship between the two sisters. The sequel has to emphasize all of the other stuff. The history. It starts off with a flashback showing that the reason the parents died, which in the first movie is just a horrible tragedy, it realizes that there's deeper lore to it. The movie goes into the backstory of Arendelle and goes into the details of this world and Elsa's powers. They felt that this was the only way to expand on the original movie. I would argue that this is probably not true. When you look at the first movie, it actually isn't as tightly wounded as the other Disney movies I've mentioned. The relationship between the sisters is mended, but it isn't perfect. There are still issues with their core dynamic, which can be resolved in the sequel. Hell, they spend the majority of the first movie separated from each other. This would have been a good opportunity to have the sequel just focus on their dynamic, having them be like the buddy pairing, but the movie really doesn't go in that direction. And instead has Elsa and Anna once again separated and makes Elsa to be some kind of Avatar chosen one figure. The movie tries to tackle broader themes. Its questioning of the parents' backstory brings up ideas of colonialism, but these ideas are only momentarily looked at. They're never examined. And ultimately, it does feel like the kids' relationships with their parents, even from beyond the grave, is still strong. This is also reflected in how the film is shot. The first movie is trying to convey a very specific emotion with Elsa. She is isolated from everyone, so the film is shot in an isolating way. The filmmaking is informed by the theme. But Frozen 2 lacks a theme, and so instead the shots are more informed by just showing off the cinematic space, showing off the vast landscape of the film. Even in Kristoff's 80s style comedy song, it's ultimately style with no point. It's meant to look like an old MTV music video, but to what cost? It adds ultimately nothing to the story. One way they could have expanded on the first movie was with Elsa's character. The first movie is very much Anna's film. We get to know about her, we get to learn about her, and we get to kind of live with her for that period of time in the film. Whereas with Frozen 2, there was really an opportunity to explore Elsa, who really didn't have a character in the first one. She's defined by her surroundings and by elements that are out of her control. A lot of the big moments of the movie are defined by the fact that she's free and she feels free, but who is she? Who is she as a person? These are questions that would have been interesting to answer in the second movie. But instead, once again, she lacks a character. There's multiple scenes where she is hanging out with the group, Anna, Olaf, and Kristoff, but she feels out of place. She's not really one of them, really. That would have been an interesting thing to explore. What is her relationship with Kristoff? But they never even touch that. Another issue that the film has is its forcing of references and inclusion of every character from the first movie. Kristoff has nothing to do in this movie. Like, really nothing. He has a weird I want to propose subplot that ultimately goes nowhere. He disappears for a large portion of the story, basically unexplained. He probably shouldn't have been in this movie at all, or he probably at least shouldn't have been on the main adventure or quest. But there was a need to have everything that the people loved about the first movie back. There's even a callback to Let It Go. Ultimately, despite my problems, and despite the fact that the movie was not as critically well received or didn't have as much big impact on the culture, it was still a resounding hit, making over $1 billion once again. While not the highest grossing movie of the year, it was a success. Enough of it is a success that they are now planning 2 more sequels concurrently with each other, which will presumably come out relatively soon. Animation takes a long time, which is funny. All of these movies have been very rushed productions, despite the fact that they take years between films, just because animation just takes an absurdly long time to do. I must admit, I don't have a lot of hope for these sequels. I can't see them fixing these issues, especially with how the second one ends. Anna is now the queen, and Elsa is now a guardian or god in this world, or however you call it. Either way, the next movie once again probably won't have time to really develop their relationship. It will once again be more focused on them separated. And because they're making these movies concurrently and presumably, but ultimately, even if 3 and 4 are bad, it doesn't really matter. It will never take away from the first movie's power. And at the end of the day, the first movie will always be a good movie, and there will be no denying that.